So hello, my name is Warren Davison, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about approximating hand-drawn maps. So I initially planned this talk to focus on hand-drawn maps, but it actually kind of encompasses like any kind of like manual cartography. And I'd like to give a special shout out to Vanessa, wherever there you are, who covered a lot of the important stuff, and I'm just gonna go through the lighthearted stuff, because all that kind of like reference and material gathering is what she spoke to, and that's key to this. So I admire those that do the manual cartography and the hand-drawn stuff. It's so impressive, and who hone their craft doing that. But I have 2 small children, and I have 0 time to devote to the hand-drawn mapping. I've made small forays into that field, but I find that my proficiency kind of lies in the digital realm, and I like to kind of use geospatial data sets as kind of a scaffolding to jump off into my artistic endeavors. So as for why someone might want to do this, it's kind of whether it applies to like a data visualization or you're creating a bespoke base map or anything like that. I find that even like putting the slightest bit of kind of manual cartography or hand-drawn aesthetic kind of lends an emotional quality to a map, or sorry, lends more tangible quality to a map. And that's a powerful tool for kind of eliciting an emotional response and contributing to kind of the world building surrounding your map. So to that effect, I wanted to share this quote on the topic of world building from Adam Savage, who's actually of Mythbusters fame, who had a long career in kind of special effects model making for Star Wars, etc. at ILM. And he was describing the difference between the construction of models for Star Trek ships and Star Wars ships, and stated that in Star Trek there's 5 things neatly in a row on a ship, and in Star Wars there's never 5 things in a row. There's 3 things and then a blank spot with a rush streak and then something different. And I think this quote kind of embodies how the visual aesthetic or design language of objects, in our case maps, can help determine how those objects feel and the story that they can help to tell. So the slight imperfections, the texture, the media, and all the materials open up possibilities that can be used to help influence the story of your map. And if you're a little bit nerdy, that perfection in Star Trek kind of speaks to like the utopia, and the imperfections in Star Wars kind of speak to the dystopian lived-in world and beat-up spaceships. So if there's a communicative power in hand-drawn maps, and starting with kind of spatial data sets as opposed to a blank page might be faster, how do we kind of get there? And in my experience, I found that this kind of loose methodology outlined here fits quite well in my digital workflow, and while also there's flexibility for alternatives depending on whether your preferred software, whether it's more GIS or Illustrator. So the loose grouping of effects in order is kind of how I apply them, is that there's that data preparation, often then generating kind of manual assets or styles, as Vanessa spoke to. Symbology effects, especially with ArcGIS Pro, that symbology pane is capable of all kinds of cool stuff. Blend modes, and then what I'm going to call everything else, or the advanced effects. And as I navigate kind of my stream of consciousness, I'm going to try and denote where things apply, whether it's hand-drawn, GIS, or design. So data preparation. Obviously, there's a lot of generalization and smoothing for any project, but as mentioned, I tend to start with some sort of geospatial data set as my starting point. And they inherently have all their accuracy and precision that we kind of have to get rid of if we want something that looks more hand-drawn. So I tend to use like generalization tools and smoothing, basically 10% beyond what any sane person would do, to take all the perfection out of the GIS data sets. And you often need to like experiment with some of the settings and parameters, but that's generally kind of the workflow. So you'll see here I've started with a city where I used to work, and it has all the perfect GIS data. And then there's that generalization step where we remove as many vertices as possible while still retaining some form of what this thing is. And then if you'll notice, the smoothing then kind of gets us towards that hand-drawn effect. And so far, we've just used our standard GIS tools. And this is where kind of now going to form the basis of our hand-drawn aesthetic that we'll heap on top. So the next fun part is the manual assets. So I know I said this was going to be all about emulating the hand drawing without actually doing it, but this is kind of a good way to kind of get into trying it, and maybe it's just like dipping your toe in, and the next thing you know, you'll be hand drawing all your maps. But this step is kind of about creating some hand-drawn analog raw assets that you can use within your map. There's also the alternative that you can go and do it in Illustrator. But I've kind of, for one of the styles I put together, I have this kind of like style sheet where I just did a whole bunch of lines, marks, and textures that with basically everything in that kind of like catch-all everything drawer in your house. And I even used a clementine once. So there's lots of options there, and basically you can then bring them into your kind of graphics tools. And as Vanessa pointed out again, it's making sure that tessellation doesn't screw up. So typically what I'll do is I'll sample a piece that I really like from my hand-drawn, flip it, and make sure that the butt ends fit up nicely together, so that's when repeated, there's going to be a nice clean join there, and it's not going to look weird. So that kind of is like a lot of the touch-up. And the last thing is that I'll then recolor those to white, because in Pro you can take white PNGs that have that no background and then just tint it to any color you want. So that makes your overhead of doing all those hand-drawn things really beneficial if you then go in and kind of assemble it into a style. And then once I have those in a style, I'll then apply some symbology effects. So the things I like to do are roughen the edges with the wave effect. In Pro, you can also, in Illustrator, there is a roughen edges tool if the thing is vector. I like to move and shift geometry. This is where it kind of gets out of the hand-drawn and more into like the misaligned plates, those very like vintage retro effects. And then multiple symbology layers. So you can see there I've taken one stroke and just basically repeated it, shifted it, so that it kind of becomes a scribble, and then you can use that around any kind of polygon fill. And that's an example of like stacking and adding some of that sketchiness, so it no longer looks like one hard-edged GIS dataset. And then blend modes. So blend modes are fantastic. All kinds of cool ways to use them. The way I typically use them is adding them in with paper texture. You can also use them for kind of doing that overprinting. So there's that, kind of misaligned plates, intentionally mixing colors to create a third. Think of like halftones or watercolors, that kind of thing. And the other place that I've kind of started to try using them is basically as distressing masks. So if you go out and take a picture of concrete, and then you go and put like a levels adjustment on it in your image editor, so it's just white and black, you can then use that with like screen or difference, I believe, and that will kind of emulate that inkware, that flaking, and it probably belongs more in like a vintage shop than your GIS software. And that kind of gives it that crunchiness. So, and then kind of the everything else. This is where you kind of, again, can infuse more of that hand-drawn. It's not for every map, but sometimes when warranted, I like to add a little extra cartographic garnish using things like pictorial illustrations. And incorporating those kind of makes it feel more in that realm. And adding those analog effects with digital tools. So examples of some sketches I've done of many of the buildings in Uptown, or the trees. And I'll often either do those with textured digital brushes. So there's all kinds of brush packs you can find that you can do those things, or you can even make your own. And then there's other kind of, and I lean heavily on those, sorry. So one point of like workflow is that depending on the map I'm making, I don't always know where I want to put those illustration garnishes. So if I don't know where I'm going to put them, I often lean towards like a vector brush, and I do all my illustrations in vector, and then that way when I scale it, those textured brush strokes remain, and I can scale and skew as much as I want. I'm not going to screw up resolution. But if it's something where I know exactly where I'm going to be putting the illustration, and perhaps I've pre-planned it, then I have done the raster workflow for that, which is a different kind of textured brush. But sometimes what I did for this actually is I went and hand drew these buildings all on one 8.5 by 11, and then brought them in and cleaned them up with a graphics tool. But there's just multiple ways that you can kind of infuse that hand-drawn in there without spending all the time hand drawing the entire map. So that's where when efficiency kind of can happen. The other thing I just wanted to point out, I don't know how clearly it shows, but there have, to that kind of point Vanessa made about researching and looking at what you kind of want to emulate. One thing that kind of like I really like is those mid-century kind of maps. They're kind of the retro ones where there's ink bleed over top, misaligned plates, crunchiness. And one thing, as I've learned to understand, is like ink starve. So as the plate hits, there's the ink, like a really hard edge. But then as that viscosity of the ink pulls back, there's actually like a thinner application of ink right at the border. So like finding ways to incorporate that just to make it, again, more tangible and let the map kind of tell the story. And that there's also like macros in Photoshop and things out there for that. And I just, as a final note, I'd like to point out that no matter the mix of methods used along the way, that this workflow kind of benefits greatly from moderation and subtlety. The goal is that when someone looking at your map shouldn't be able to really pick out exactly the things you did. It's kind of like the greater, I don't know the saying, something about some of the parts. And so that's kind of how they each complement each other and achieve the greatest effect, is when you can't quite discern what exact series of actions was taken to kind of make the map as a whole. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.